My daughter-in-law Tessa laughed at my quilting for years. But the night she mocked my late husband's unfinished quilt, in front of the entire family reunion, something inside me finally broke. She held up the half-sewn patchwork, the one Arthur spent 3 winters cutting fabric for before his hands gave out, and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "Can you believe people used to actually hang things like this on their walls?" The room went quiet. My son Philip stared at his shoes. My granddaughter Wren looked ready to cry, and I stood there in the church fellowship hall, holding a serving dish of sweet potato casserole, feeling my face go hot with something I had spent 5 years convincing myself wasn't shame. That night, on the long drive home, I made a quiet decision. Tessa would not be invited to the next family gathering I organized. She thought she was making a joke. She had no idea she was unraveling the last thread, holding this family together. Most people who meet me now see an old woman in comfortable shoes. 64 years old. Widowed. Living alone in the same craftsman house in Macon, Georgia, where I raised my children and buried 2 dogs and spent 31 years building a life with a man who deserved more time than he got. My husband Arthur Webb died 4 years ago. A stroke, quiet as a door closing. He was sitting in his workshop chair with a cup of coffee and a half-finished quilt block in his lap. The paramedic said it was fast. I choose to believe that. Arthur was the kind of man who hummed while he worked, who left little notes on the bathroom mirror when he had early shifts, who once drove 4 hours in the rain because I called him crying, after a hard day at the school where I taught reading for 22 years. We had 2 children. My son Philip Webb is 41 now. He lives 40 minutes away in a newer subdivision outside of Warner Robins, the kind of neighborhood with matching mailboxes and HOA newsletters. Philip works in hospital administration. He's steady and responsible, and sometimes I catch myself looking at him and seeing Arthur in the way he tilts his head when he's thinking hard. My daughter Cecily Webb moved to Portland, Oregon, 8 years ago for graduate school and never came back, not really. She teaches sociology at a university and calls me every Sunday evening. She is gentle and funny, and gets anxious about things she cannot control, which is something I understand completely. And then there is Tessa Holloway Webb, Philip's wife. She came from a well-off family outside of Atlanta, private school, international travel before college, the kind of background where comfort was so consistent it became invisible. She's not an unkind woman in the clinical sense. She loves Philip. I believe that. She is organized and successful and genuinely good with Wren, their 9-year-old daughter. But she has never quite known what to do with me, or with this house, or with anything that couldn't be described as curated. The quilting started as Arthur's thing, actually. That surprises people. A big man with mechanic's hands, and he took up quilting the winter after he retired because he said his hands needed something to do, or they'd get restless. He wasn't wrong. I learned alongside him because that's how we did most things. Together, badly at first, then better. We joined a guild in town. We made terrible early attempts that we kept as jokes and beautiful later ones that we gave away. After he died, continuing felt impossible for a while. Then it felt necessary. The fabric, the patterns, the specific focus it required. It kept me here. Kept me present in a way that grief otherwise doesn't allow. The first time Tessa made a comment, Philip and I were still in the early fog of losing Arthur. She had come over to help me clear the workshop. Her version of helping, which meant standing in the doorway cataloging things that could be donated. She picked up one of Arthur's quilt blocks, turned it over twice, and said, "Does anyone actually use these?" Not cruel, exactly. More like confused. The way someone might examine an artifact from a culture they'd never considered joining. I said yes, people do, and took it gently from her hands. But that was the beginning. Over the next 2 years, the comments accumulated the way small things do. Quietly, until you suddenly realize the pile is large enough to matter. At Thanksgiving, she told the guests that I'd made the table runner myself, and the way she said it had a tone underneath, like she was managing expectations. At Christmas, she redirected Wren away from the quilt frame I'd set up in the guest room. "Grandma's busy with her project, let's not bother it." At Philip's birthday dinner, she introduced me to one of her colleagues as Philip's mom. She does a lot of handcrafts. Handcrafts? I remember driving home from that dinner and sitting in my driveway for 10 minutes before going inside. The worst part was how Philip reacted to my silence on the subject. When I tried once carefully to tell him that some of Tessa's comments stung, he said, "Mom, you know how she is. She doesn't mean it." And then softer, "She's just not a sentimental person." I thought about that a lot. What it means to not be a sentimental person. And whether the things that aren't sentimental to you can still be real and valuable to someone else. I kept going to Guild. I kept making quilts. I kept inviting the family for Sunday dinners and holiday weekends. And the annual reunion I'd organized every August, since Arthur and I first got married. The reunion was a web tradition going back 30 years. It's extended family from 4 states. Potluck tables, children running barefoot until dark. Arthur's sister Margaret Webb playing piano on the porch until someone always eventually cried and laughed at the same time. Margaret Webb is 81 now and moves slowly, but she never misses the reunion. This past August, I had worked for 6 months preparing. The fellowship hall at our church, which we'd always used, was booked for 3 days. I cooked and organized and contacted every branch of family. I also decided to display a collection of quilts, family pieces going back 4 generations, along the walls. Arthur's mother had made 2 of them. Arthur himself had made 3, and the unfinished one, the patchwork quilt he had been working on the winter before he died, a wedding ring pattern in blues and grays. I framed and mounted carefully, with a small card that said simply, "Started by Arthur Webb, finished in our hearts." The afternoon of the reunion, Tessa arrived with Philip and Wren and 2 of her friends from Atlanta who had been visiting, and apparently weren't sure what else to do with their Saturday. I hadn't known she was bringing guests. I didn't say anything. For the first hour, everything was fine. Better than fine. Margaret played piano. Wren discovered a second cousin her age, and they disappeared into the yard together. Old family members stood in front of the quilts, pointing at fabric patterns, telling stories about where certain pieces of cloth had come from, a dress, a curtain, a shirt that used to belong to someone no longer living. Then I heard Tessa's voice, bright and carrying, from across the room. She was standing in front of Arthur's unfinished quilt with her 2 Atlanta friends, and she had her phone out. "Can you believe people used to actually hang things like this on their walls?" She tilted her head slightly, the way people do when they're performing observation for an audience. "It's so busy. Like visually, it's so much." One of her friends said something I couldn't hear. Tessa laughed. "I know. Very wholesome, though. Very Georgia. Very Georgia." I was holding the sweet potato casserole. My hands were steady. Inside I was not. Margaret Webb had heard. I could tell by the way she stopped playing mid-phrase. Philip was across the room talking to a cousin and had not heard, or had not wanted to hear. What happened next surprised even me. I didn't cry. I didn't say anything at all. I set the casserole down on the nearest table, walked to the display wall, and stood quietly beside Arthur's quilt for a long moment. Several family members came and stood with me, because that's what family does. Tessa looked over, registered my expression, and said, "Oh, come on." I was just, and then she stopped, because even she could see that the room had shifted around her. I went home that night and couldn't sleep. I sat in the workshop where Arthur used to hum, in his old chair, with the quilt he never finished folded in my lap. And I let myself feel the full weight of it, not just that night, all of it. Every small dismissal, every redirected child, every "she does handcrafts." I thought about all the times I had adjusted myself to manage her discomfort, how I had stopped mentioning the guild, how I had put away the quilt frame when they visited so there would be nothing to draw a comment, how I had quietly shrunk the most constant healing thing in my life to avoid the judgment of someone who didn't understand it, and I thought about Arthur's quilt, the way she had held up her phone. The next morning I called Philip. "I'm not inviting Tessa to the Thanksgiving gathering this year," I said. "That's a decision I've made." A silence. Then, "Mom, I love you," I said. "I want to see you and Wren, but I am not going to go through another family event the way I went through yesterday." Philip said we should talk about it. I said I agreed and I was available whenever he wanted to call back. Then I hung up. He called back 4 days later. Those 4 days were strange. I kept expecting guilt to overwhelm me, the way it usually did whenever I held a boundary long enough for it to become real. But the gilt was smaller than I expected, and underneath it something that had been wound tight for years had loosened just slightly. Philip's voice when he called back was careful. "She's upset," he said. "I imagined so. She thinks you're being unfair. I understand that, Mom." She just made a thoughtless comment. I took a breath. "Philip?" It wasn't one comment. Quiet on the line. "She has been dismissing the things that matter most to me for 5 years. She said something cruel in front of your father's unfinished quilt, with her phone out, while his family was standing 10 feet away. And she didn't apologize. She said, 'Oh, come on.'" More quiet. Then Philip exhaled slowly. "I didn't know it had been going on that long. I know you didn't. That's also something I've been thinking about." We stayed on the phone a long time without resolving anything. But something shifted in his voice by the end. Less defending her, more just sitting with what I'd said. Thanksgiving that year was smaller. Philip came with Ren, but not Tessa, which was its own complicated kind of quiet. Cecily flew in from Portland. We cooked together and put a quilt on every bed, and let Ren pick what movie we watched after dinner. It wasn't the loudest Thanksgiving I'd ever hosted, but it was real in a way that the last few hadn't been. At one point Ren climbed into my lap and asked, "Is Tessa coming for Christmas?" I smoothed her hair. "I'm not sure yet, sweetheart." Ren was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Grandpa's quilt looks like a puzzle someone gave up on." Something cold went through me. When did she say that? On the way home from the reunion. I held my granddaughter a little tighter. That December, a friend from my quilting guild, Harriet Odom, told me about a community textile exhibit being organized at the Macon Museum of Arts and Sciences. Local artists, makers, quilters. A curator named Denise Frazier was pulling it together and had reached out to the guild looking for contributions and for people willing to speak about the history of their work. I almost said no. The same small voice that had been quiet for years whispered, "Who would be interested in this?" And underneath that voice I recognized Tessa's tone, and that recognition was what made me say yes. I submitted 4 quilts, Arthur's finished ones, and the unfinished wedding ring quilt, which Denise Frazier spent 20 minutes on the phone with me talking through before she said quietly, "I think this might be the centerpiece." The exhibit opened in February. I didn't tell Philip or Tessa about it ahead of time. Cecily flew in. Harriet and 2 other women from the guild came. Margaret Webb came with a friend who drove slowly and took 45 minutes to park. Standing in that gallery, looking at Arthur's wedding ring quilt under proper lighting, with a card beside it that explained its history and its incompleteness, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not grief, exactly, and not pride, exactly. Something between them. A sense that the thing I had been told was small was not, in fact, small. Denise Frazier gave a short speech during the opening reception. She talked about the history of American quilting as memory keeping, as documentation, as love-made material. She used the phrase functional art, and then said, carefully, that the word functional sometimes makes people think lesser of something, when actually it means the love was useful. It did something. It kept people warm. Harriet leaned over and whispered, "She's talking about you." I laughed despite myself. Someone photographed the exhibit for the local paper. Cecily posted about it. Philip saw the post. He called that evening. "Mom, you're in the paper." "Apparently, why didn't you tell me?" I thought about how to answer that. I wasn't sure how it would go, I said finally. I didn't want to perform it for anyone before it happened. A pause. Then, "The quilt looks beautiful, Dad's quilt." My throat tightened. "It does. Mom, I'm sorry I didn't take the thing with Tessa more seriously." I closed my eyes. "Thank you for saying that. She needs to apologize to you." I told her that. "Okay. She's been defensive about it." But I told her. I didn't push. I had spent too many years pushing too gently on things that needed to be said plainly and not enough years saying them plainly. I was still learning. 3 weeks after the exhibit opened, Tessa sent me a text message. Not a call. A text. "I've been thinking about what Philip said. I don't always think before I speak at social things. I didn't realize how much the quilting meant to you, or to the family. I'm sorry for the comment at the reunion. I know that's not enough, but I wanted to say it. I read it 4 times. It wasn't enough. She was right about that. But it was real in a way her comments never had been. And I had learned in the last year that real and incomplete is worth more than polished and hollow. I wrote back, "Thank you for saying this. I'd like us to keep talking." Philip brought Tessa to my house for dinner the following Sunday. It was the first time she'd been inside since before the reunion. She walked through the living room slowly, the way Vanessa had walked through mine. No, I stopped myself. Tessa's was not Vanessa. This was not that story. This was its own story, and I had to let it be. She stopped in front of a quilt I had framed on the living room wall. Blue and green and cream, courthouse steps pattern, made by Arthur's mother the year Philip was born. "How long did something like this take?" she asked. Her voice was different, not performing. "She made this one in about 4 months," I said. "But she made quilts her whole life, so her hands were fast." Tessa was quiet. "I've never made anything with my hands," she said. Not proudly, just truthfully. I didn't say anything for a moment. Then I said, "Do you want to try?" She looked at me, surprised. "I'd probably be terrible." "Yes," I said. For a while. Something shifted in her expression then. Not transformation. That kind of thing doesn't happen in a kitchen doorway on a Sunday afternoon. But something loosened. Dinner was quiet and careful. Not warm exactly. Not yet. Wren talked enough to fill the spaces. Philip kept glancing between us, with the expression of a man who was grateful things weren't on fire. After dinner, Tessa helped clear the table without being asked. When she passed through the dining room, she paused in front of a small framed photo I keep there. Arthur at the quilt frame, laughing at something outside the frame of the picture, his hands visible, holding fabric. "He really did this," she said, almost to herself. "He did." She looked at it a moment longer. "I think I assumed the quilting was something you did to fill time after he was gone." "He taught me," I said. "Or we taught each other." Tessa nodded slowly. "I didn't know that." I looked at my husband's photograph. "There's a lot people don't know unless they asks." She heard that. I could tell. Before they left, Tessa stopped at the door and said, without Philip in the room, "I'd actually like to come back, if the invitation is open." I looked at her for a moment. "The invitation is always open," I said. "I just need you to treat the things in this house with respect." She held my gaze. "I understand." We didn't hug. That will come, or it won't. But we stood there in the doorway in something that felt like the beginning of an honest understanding. And that felt like more than I'd had a year ago. After they left, I went into the workshop. I sat in Arthur's chair. The workshop smelled faintly of fabric and old wood, and something that might have just been memory. I didn't turn on the television. I just sat with the quiet, and then I picked up a needle and started working on a new quilt. Not for anyone, not to prove anything, just because it was what my hands knew how to do. And because somewhere in those stitches was the closest thing I had to a conversation with the man who taught me that love, when you really mean it, tends to become something you can hold. I thought about all the years I spent adjusting myself to be smaller so someone else could feel more comfortable. How long it took me to understand that shrinking yourself is not kindness. It is just loss wearing a patient face. I am not the woman I was 5 years ago. Before I learned that dignity is not something you earn back once it's taken. You simply decide, one ordinary morning, to stop giving it away. Arthur used to say that a quilt is just a conversation between pieces that wouldn't ordinarily be put together. You force nothing. You find the pattern. You trust that what belongs together will hold. I think that's true of families too. And of women who finally, figure out who they have always been.